This is from a long time ago, when there were no cell phones, let alone smartphones, and PCs were not widely used. I was working at the head office of a company when I was suddenly transferred to a regional city, with orders to open a sales office and develop a new market. From then on, every day was a series of hard work, but I managed to set up a sales office, acquire some customers, and sales grew steadily and became profitable. When I was finally relieved from the pressure, I met a young local girl through work, and after dating her for about a year, we got married. I was in my mid-30s at the time, and she was in her mid-20s. My wife was good-looking and good at housework. I was 10 years older than her, and I thought I had the upper ground. But to my surprise, my wife was more aggressive, and I remember being surprised at how quickly things progressed. Upon marriage, we moved out of the single-person apartment we had been living in and rented a single-family home. My wife became a stay-at-home housewife, as most did at the time, and although she had settled down a bit, she still supported me in my work. Things were going well like that for the first 3 years. However, after the next 3 years, a dark cloud suddenly appeared in my life. One morning, I arrived at the office as usual, picked up the newspaper and other mail from the post box by the entrance, and went inside. I looked at the mail on the desk and found a letter addressed to me in a plain envelope. Feeling a little weird about it, I opened the envelope, which didn't have an office address, nor a sender, and felt quite troubled by the content. The contents could be summed up simply like this: your wife often brings a young guy into your home during the day when you are not there. Naturally, I was appalled. But then, I thought back on it. I realized that I had indeed been a bit concerned about it. There were some small things in the bedroom that had been misplaced, and there was a subtle odor in the room that smelled like some men's shampoo that I had never used before. It was so trivial that I had forgot about it immediately, but when I was told about it, I felt that I had an idea of what had happened. For a while, I was stunned and in shock, but not completely surprised. I thought about hiring a professional to do a proper investigation, but I could not find a reliable one, probably because of the small population in the provincial city. I was at a loss because the internet was not so common at the time, so I could not find anything in the phone book, and since I had been working since I moved here, I did not have any acquaintances outside of work. I had no choice but to set up a trap for my wife myself, using the times of day the man visited our home that was indicated in the letter as reference. After returning home that day, I promptly told my wife that I was going on a 2-day business trip next week, and spent the rest of the day putting on a normal face so that she would not be aware of my plan. As is often the case with this kind of thing, people would choke on their food or throw up when they ate because they'd feel sick, but I was surprisingly calm. Then came the day of that business trip that I told her about. As usual, I drove out of the house, parked my car in a spot where I could see the house in the distance, and kept an eye on it for a few hours. As time passed by with me sitting in the car, I thought about many things. I wondered if what was written in the letter was true, or if someone was laughing at me while I was killing time like this. Even if the letter was true, I wondered if it would be easy to catch the guy in a day. All kinds of thoughts came to me, and I was getting tired of keeping an eye on them. But I thought to myself, just wait a little more. And about midday, some young man entered my home, and after another 30 minutes, there was no sign of him coming out. I moved my car to the back of the house and quietly entered it through the kitchen door. I slowly called around, but there was no sign of anyone on the first floor. Thinking that someone must be there, I listened carefully and heard a faint voice coming from the second floor. I then walked up the stairs and stood in front of the bedroom on the second floor. When I went up the stairs, I desperately tried not to leave any trace, so at first, I didn't recognize the voice. But the moment I stood in front of the bedroom door, I understood. The voice that I heard from inside, it was my wife's, in the middle of doing that. At that moment, something in my mind violently popped inside my head. I didn't realize it myself, but now I think that somewhere in my mind, I had thought that letter was a lie and that my wife was probably innocent, but it turns out the letter was telling the truth. I immediately felt a rage, or indignation, or some other indescribable emotion that seemed to go beyond that. I took off my jacket, removed my tie, kicked in the bedroom door, and went inside. On the bed, my wife and the young man were frozen in that position. I said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" I shouted loudly and rushed to the side. Even though my wife was being held down on the bed, she said, "No, no, no," or something like that, but her words couldn't reach me because my blood had rushed to my head. I silently grabbed the young man, who looked pale and stiff, lifted him up, dragged him, and pushed him from the top of the stairs. He rolled down the stairs and fell to the first floor, moaning. But after I punched and kicked him several times, he passed out, probably from the pain. I looked down at this guy that I didn't know to make sure he was not moving and returned upstairs to find my wife dressed and ready to run away. I had never raised my voice against my wife before, let alone hit her, so she seemed quite surprised at my attitude this time, and she was very pale. I grabbed my wife and slapped her about a dozen times before asking her why she'd done what she did. My wife, perhaps horrified, frankly confessed. "You were always working, so I got very lonely. The boy was a local college student, and we met through a chance encounter. We have been dating for about a year. Even though you didn't care about me, I'm sorry for doing this. I will leave the guy soon. Just please don't divorce me." In hindsight, I was clearly crazy at the time, or rather, I think I was temporarily insane. I dragged my wife, who confessed everything, and pushed her down the stairs. Then, I searched the closet, took a cable tie, and tied both their arms and legs tightly together. They had both regained consciousness, but they seemed to have broken something and were unable to move, crying and begging for forgiveness and moaning in pain from time to time. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. It was just a game. I will change from now on. Please forgive me. I'm sorry, I won't do it again, so please let this slide." They were both so loud that it was getting on my nerves, so I remained silent and took a towel from the bedroom and used it to gag and silence them. They still kept yelling something, but I kept ignoring them. Then, a few hours later, late in the evening, I picked up my wife and the young man, who were rolling around and no longer able to scream, one by one, and shoved them into the trunk of my car. It seemed both of them came to their senses. They put up a fair amount of resistance, so I put them down on the floor, kicked them a few times, and when they were docile, I stowed them away and went for a late-night drive. The house we lived in at the time was in a fairly rural area, so after about a 20-minute drive, we were already in the mountains. After a while on the tourist road, I felt impressed by and drove along a dirt road in the valley for a while. Then, there were the ruins of a huge mine, which were spread out in the mouth of the mountain. I was a bit of a ruins enthusiast, and knowing that there was a huge mine site, I had explored it several times and knew every corner of it. I drove into the decaying building of the huge ruin, stopped the car in front of a hole about 3 meters deep, and let them out of the trunk. Then I said a final goodbye to my wife. "Thank you for living with a boring, workaholic man like me. But I wasn't good enough for you, huh? Please live happily with him from now on." I then dragged them to the edge of the hole and kicked them down into it. Then I dropped their shoes, bags, and a cutter knife to cut the cable ties and left the place. I drove nonchalantly down the road at night and slept like a baby after returning home. I was on vacation leave, so I spent the next 2 days just sleeping, drinking, and sleeping again. And after getting enough sleep, I cleaned and tidied up the messy house. Then, after my vacation, without even much of psychological damage, I went to work as usual. After some time had passed, as my mind recovered from what seemed to be a temporary insanity, I began to think properly about what I had done. My wife and that man will come out of the hole. If they come out, they will call the police, and then my social status and everything else will be over. I was prepared to be arrested at one point, but strangely enough, the police did not come to arrest me for many days after that. In fact, neither my wife nor the young man ever appeared before me again, as if they had vanished from the world, no matter how many months or years passed. Later, when I examined my wife's dressing table, I found various evidence of her affair, including letters and photos she had exchanged with the man. When my wife's parents learned that she was missing, they visited our home. When I showed them all the evidence I had found, they seemed to have understood and left. I think they understood that they had eloped. After a few years, I got a transfer order and I had to move out. Since my wife left, people around me seemed to think that I was a miserable husband who had his wife run away with a young man, but I was relieved when the transfer was decided. Yet, what I was curious about was why still nothing had happened. I kept wondering why, so I revisited the huge abandoned building once before I was transferred. That night, I drove along an endless mountain road, but when I revisited the site, somehow the narrow road had been widened and there were a lot of dump trucks driving around. And when I got there, everything was gone. The mine site in that hole had all disappeared cleanly, and they were in the middle of land development. A sign on the road indicated that a luxury resort hotel was going to be built, and that the land was being cleared for it. Everything had completely disappeared. Where had those two gone? And why hadn't they sued? Or maybe they were still there. I didn't know anymore. And now, decades have passed since then. My body, which had been muscular and toned back then, was now completely wasted. My hair, which used to be dark, is now completely white, reminding me of the years. Now, it has become unclear to me whether it really happened or if it was all a dream. In another 10 years, I may forget everything. I live day by day not knowing if that is a good or bad thing. Thank you for watching. Did you enjoy it? We look forward to seeing you again. Please also subscribe to our channel.